The 200 series John Deere lawn and garden tractors use a unique system called variable speed drive to control ground speed. The variable speed drive enables the operator to change ground speed without shifting gears or changing the engine RPM. By changing the position of the variable speed control, the operator can select a variety of speeds in all gears. In this program, we'll show you how the variable speed drive works and how it changes drive ratios. This knowledge will help you adjust and repair the drive system on 200 series tractors. This program will also show you how to adjust the variable speed drive and how to service the major components in the system. This drawing shows how the variable speed drive system would look if you peeled away all the sheet metal and framework surrounding it on the tractor. The primary belt transmits power from the engine drive sheave to the variator sheave. The secondary belt transmits power from the variator sheave to the transmission-driven sheave. As you can see, the variator is the center of the variable speed drive system. It's the part that connects the drive end of the system to the driven end. It's also the major component in the system that works to change drive ratios. Since it's the main component in the system, let's take a closer look at it. Essentially, the variator is a double sheave. This cutaway view shows that the variator consists of two half sheaves, a center sheave and a hub. The center sheave moves freely from side to side. As it moves, the diameter varies on both sides of the double sheave. As one side becomes larger, the other side becomes smaller. This effect is easier to see with the belts in the grooves. The primary belt rides in the left groove. The secondary belt rides in the right groove. Here the tension is equal on both belts, and the sheave diameter is equal on both sides. If tension increases on the primary belt exerts force on the center sheave and moves it over to the right. That decreases the diameter of the primary belt's groove, and it also increases the diameter of the secondary belt's groove. Likewise, if the secondary belt tightens, it forces the center sheave towards the primary belt. That makes the sheave's secondary diameter smaller and the sheave's primary diameter larger. You've seen how the two sheaves on the variator change diameter. Now let's see how those changing diameters work to change drive ratios. Here you see the drive with the primary belt as tight as possible. The primary belt sheave is in its smallest diameter, and the secondary belt sheave is in its largest diameter. The variable speed drive system is now in its highest speed ratio because the engine is driving a smaller primary sheave and the larger secondary sheave is driving the transmission sheave. Ground speed is the fastest in this setting. Here the secondary belt is as tight as possible. The primary sheave is large and the secondary sheave is small. The system is now in its lowest ratio and ground speed is slowest in that gear. Those are the two extremes of the system. In general, when the primary belt gets tighter, the system shifts to a high ratio and ground speed increases. When the secondary belt gets tighter, the system shifts to a lower ratio and ground speed decreases. Remember that relationship because it's basic to understanding how the system works. When the primary belt tightens, the drive ratio is higher and ground speed increases. When the secondary belt tightens, drive ratio is lower and ground speed decreases. So belt tension determines the drive ratio. But what determines belt tension? The position of the variator sheave assembly. Moving the variator sheave rearward increases primary belt tension and reduces secondary belt tension. Moving the variator sheave forward reduces primary belt tension and increases secondary belt tension. Now, three things control the movement of the variator sheave: the tension of the variator spring, the position of the variable speed control lever, and the position of the clutch pedal. In this drawing, we've added the variator spring. The variator sheave is attached to a pivot arm, and the variator spring pulls the pivot arm and variator sheave away from the drive sheave. The variator spring puts tension on the primary belt to make it tighter. Here the variator spring has pulled the primary belt as tight as possible, putting the system into its highest ratio. An idler puts some tension on the secondary belt to keep it from coming loose. However, The spring on the idler is not as strong as the variator spring, so it cannot overcome the tension that the variator spring applies. The variator spring is attached to the tractor frame and is adjustable. The system is sensitive to load changes, and adjusting the spring changes that sensitivity. By load sensitivity, we mean this. With a tractor going uphill, as you see on the left side of the screen, the load on the tractor increases. The secondary belt tightens, and that downshifts the tractor to a lower drive ratio. If the load lightens, as when going downhill, like you see on the right, tension on the secondary belt decreases, and the variator spring pulls the primary belt tighter. That shifts the system into a higher drive ratio. If the spring is adjusted tightly, it will resist downshifting, and it will take a heavier load to put the system into a lower ratio. If the spring tension is lighter, the system becomes more sensitive to load changes. It will take less of a load to downshift the tractor. Later in the program, we'll show you the proper way to make spring adjustment. Now, let's add the variable speed control lever, which is the second part that controls belt tension. The control lever is attached to linkage, which moves the pivot arm. With the control lever in the rear position, the variator moves closer to the drive sheave. The secondary belt tightens and the primary belt loosens, so the center sheave moves over. The primary sheave now has a larger diameter, and the secondary sheave has a smaller diameter. That puts the drive in a low ratio. So when the control lever is pulled back, ground speed decreases. Moving the control lever forward lets the variator spring pull the variator sheave away from the drive sheave. Notice that the control linkage itself does not pull the variator away. The variator spring does. The primary belt tightens and makes the primary sheave diameter smaller. The secondary sheave diameter becomes larger, and the system shifts to a high ratio. So when the control lever is pushed forward, ground speed increases. Finally, let's add the third part of the system that controls belt tension, the clutch linkage. Here the clutch pedal is depressed, which moves the variator sheave closer to the drive sheave. In fact, it moves it so close that the primary belt becomes loose and no longer transmits power from the drive sheave to the variator. Releasing the clutch pedal lets the variator spring pull the variator sheave back away from the drive sheave. The variator sheave moves as far away as the control lever setting allows it to. The primary belt tightens and the variator transmits power from the drive sheave. Before we continue, notice that the pivot arm link is connected to the variable speed control lever shaft in a slotted hole. The slot allows the clutch linkage to move the variator forward without changing the position of the variable speed control lever. Let's review how the variable speed drive system works. The variator is the center of the system, and it has a movable center sheave. When the center sheave moves, the ratio between the primary belt sheave and the secondary belt sheave changes. That changes the system's drive ratio. When tension increases on the primary belt, the center sheave moves toward the secondary belt. The primary sheave becomes smaller and the secondary sheave becomes larger. The system shifts into a higher ratio, which increases ground speed. But when the tension increases on the secondary belt, the center sheave moves toward the primary belt. That makes the primary sheave larger and the secondary sheave smaller. The system shifts into a lower ratio, which decreases ground speed. The variator spring pulls the variator sheave away from the drive sheave. That tightens the primary belt and puts the system into its highest drive ratio. However, if load on the tractor increases, the secondary belt tightens and moves the center sheave over. The system downshifts to a lower drive ratio. When the load on the tractor decreases, the variator spring pulls back on the variator, tightening the primary belt and putting the system into a higher drive ratio. The control lever and its linkage lets the operator determine ground speed by changing belt tension. Pulling the lever back moves the variator toward the drive sheave. The secondary belt tightens and the system shifts to a lower drive ratio, decreasing ground speed. Pushing the lever forward lets the variator spring pull the variator away from the drive sheave. That tightens the primary belt, shifting the system to a higher drive ratio and faster ground speed. And finally, the clutch linkage, when depressed, moves the variator toward the drive sheave. That loosens the primary belt and stops power to the variator from the drive sheave. When the operator lets up on the clutch, the variator spring pulls back on the variator sheave, tightening the primary belt as much as the control lever allows, putting the system back in drive. Now that you've seen how the system works, take the time to test your knowledge of the variable speed drive. We'll ask a short question about the drive and then stop the program. Press restart when you have an answer ready. In the condition shown, the primary belt is tight and the secondary belt is riding in the larger groove. Is the clutch engaged or disengaged? Is the control lever pushed forward or pulled back? Press restart when you're ready. To make the primary belt tight, the clutch would have to be engaged and the control lever would have to be pushed forward, allowing the variator spring to pull the variator sheave away from the drive sheave. How about this condition? What could cause the center sheave to be in the middle, making the diameter of both sheaves equal? Press restart when you're ready. If the control lever was located in the number 3 notch, the belts would be approximately in the position shown, or the clutch could be partially disengaged. Here you see the primary belt is entirely loose. What's the most likely cause? Press restart when you have an answer. When the primary belt is so loose that it no longer transmits power, most likely the clutch is disengaged. The belt would also be loose if the belt was stretched and the control lever was in the number 1 notch. If the variator spring is broken or the variator linkage is incorrectly adjusted, the primary belt could also become loose. By now, you should have a better sense of how the variable speed drive works. If you feel uncertain about how it works, you may want to go back to the beginning of the program and watch it again for review. Otherwise, we'll move on to adjusting the variable speed drive. We'll be discussing adjustments on current 200 series tractors. While operating and adjusting procedures are the same for older models, specific procedures may vary. Always consult your technical manual for exact procedures. The first thing to remember when adjusting the drive is to put the control lever in the number 5 position when adjusting the linkage. Normally, you should not adjust the linkage with the control lever in the number 6 or 7 position. If you did, the primary belt would soon stretch so that it would be loose with the control lever in the number 1 notch. The drive would be disengaged. With the control lever in the number 5 notch, start your adjustment procedure by removing the button plug from the adjusting hole. Then loosen the cap screw on the pivot arm link. With the transmission in neutral, start the engine and release the clutch. Let the tractor run until the clutch pedal rises as far as it will go on its own. Then stop the tractor. When you let the clutch pedal rise, the variator spring pulls the variator sheave away from the drive sheave and makes the primary belt as tight as possible. That puts the drive into the highest ratio. The pivot arm link is loose, so the linkage centers itself for the right position into notch number 5. Before tightening the cap screw and locking the linkage into place, push down on the pivot arm cap screw. That removes any slack remaining in the linkage. Then tighten the cap screw. The control lever linkage is now properly adjusted. When the control lever is in notch number 5, the variator spring can pull the primary belt as tight as possible, putting the drive into its highest ratio. Putting the lever in notch 6 or 7 has no effect on the variator's position and does not increase the tractor's ground speed. Notches 6 and 7 are functional only when the primary belt has stretched a bit. When the control linkage is properly adjusted, the belt will transmit power with the control lever in the number 1 notch. But over time, the primary belt will stretch and wear. When put into position number 1, the primary belt may be too loose to transmit power. When adjusting the variator, always start in position number 5. After that adjustment, try the number 1 position. If the tractor still does not move, you can either replace the belt with a new one or readjust the linkage. If you must use a worn belt, put the control lever into notch number 6 when adjusting the linkage. This will compensate for the wear and stretch temporarily. The variator spring can be adjusted too. Normally, the spring should be adjusted so that approximately 1 1/4 inch of thread extends past the nut. Increasing this dimension tightens the spring, and decreasing this dimension loosens the spring. The tighter the spring, the more tension it puts on the pivot arm holding the variator. With a tight spring, it takes more tension to depress the clutch. Also, as we mentioned earlier, when the spring is tight, the drive system is less sensitive to load changes. With a loose spring, it takes less effort to depress the clutch, and the drive becomes more sensitive to load changes. It downshifts more quickly under load. If the variator spring is extremely loose, the tractor may downshift too easily, or possibly not move at all. When the clutch is depressed, the primary belt becomes loose. The belt guide, shown here, pushes against the belt and causes it to balloon out away from the sheave. That disengages the belt and stops power to the transmission. The belt guide needs to be adjusted if more than 1/8 inch exists between the guide and the variator sheave. Loosen the cap screw that holds the belt guide and adjust for 1/8 inch clearance. Rotate the variator to make sure that no part of it contacts the guide. Then tighten the cap screw. That covers all the adjustments. Now let's take a look at some of the things that can go wrong in the system. The variator is the sensing unit of the whole system, so any dirt in it or damage to it can cause erratic shifting or no shifting at all. Look for dirt on the sheaves or between the hub and the center sheave. If you find dirt in the variator, you can clean the sheaves with solvent, but make sure no solvent gets on the center sheave bearing or belts. This is an oil-light bearing, and solvent would remove the lubrication from it. Clean the bearing if necessary by wiping it with a clean, dry cloth. If the bearing is worn, the center sheave will wobble on its hub, causing the system to shift erratically. Try twisting the center sheave to see if you can feel any wobbling. If you can, replace the center sheave and bearing. If the drive or driven sheaves are dirty or damaged, the system may shift erratically. The belts may even jump off the sheaves. Clean all dirt and debris from the sheaves and replace any damaged sheaves. Dirty or oily belts will upset the balance of the variable speed system. Belt dressings can cause problems too, so they should not be applied. Clean the belts by wiping them with a dry cloth or replace them if necessary. A belt that is glazed or worn thin should be replaced. The control linkage adjustment can compensate for some belt stretch, but if a belt has stretched so far that the system cannot be adjusted correctly, it should be replaced. If the clutch does not fully engage, the variator spring may be broken or weak. Replace the spring. If the drive has problems downshifting, the problem may be with the secondary belt idler. A weak or broken idler spring will not put enough tension on the secondary belt to force the center sheave over when shifting down. Replace the spring if the idler tension appears weak. The idler pivot arm and the variator pivot arm must move freely. Otherwise, the system will shift erratically or not at all. To check the pivot arms, remove all the belts and springs attached to them and then see if they move freely. If they don't, find the problem and correct the cause of the binding. Difficult clutching could be caused by problems with the clutch linkage, and erratic shifting could be caused by the control lever linkage. Check the linkages for any worn, damaged, or binding parts. Finally, remember that on some models, the clutch pedal is also a brake pedal. If the brakes are adjusted too tight, the neutral zone will be eliminated. The tractor will brake before the clutch is fully disengaged. We've covered the major components in the variable speed drive. Use the diagnosis section of the tractor's technical manual to make sure you've covered all the possibilities for any problem. That completes our look at the variable speed drive on 200 series lawn and garden tractors. By now, you should know how the variable speed drive works, and you should know how to adjust the drive and service its major components. Refer to your technical manual if you need any additional information.